if you have low comfort with uncertainty, I hope you're working on like a sequel somewhere or a live service game. Because if you're doing anything new, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And especially as leaders. And so then I go, okay, so I want to know what your comfort with uncertainty is. Then I want to know what's the quality of your leadership team, and specifically them. How comfortable are they with that uncertainty? I think all the problems that I'm going to list relate to uncertainty, and they relate to leadership. And so those are the two underlying things. And that a leader's job, you can view the leader's job through different roles. One thing I think that leaders do is they resolve the uncertainty of those they lead.
Hey, Ben, I thought we could just get right into it. You have had a career in production at Riot, a military career, and currently you're working with game studios and advising on both leadership training as well as game studio production problems. And you're with a consultancy called Building Better Games.
Yep.
And I think when we look at our industry, we've recently seen some pretty high-profile failures and potentially maybe even more of a structural problem with the way that game development is occurring, and probably more so with Western game studios, especially when we see the lack of successes in terms of new game releases. So I thought for our audience, maybe we could kind of jump right into it in terms of like, what do you think is wrong? Or would you characterize it as a problem? And from your experience working with these different game studios, what have been some of the biggest problems that you've seen?
We know that the amount of money people pay for games can only go so high.
Right.
And so there's this revenue line, and it goes up at some rate. You know, it's just like, okay, it's climbing up into the right because more players are playing or whatever it might be. It does seem to be that for a lot of games, like you do have this like, wow, look, we've grown up into the right when it comes to revenue. And you want to capitalize on that. And so what do? Well, we're going to bring in more people. We're going to like build more stuff. And you have the second line, and it's how much does it cost to make a game or to run a game? And that line also tends to go up and to the right over time. The revenue line, in my opinion, for most games, will eventually start to at least flatten out. The cost line, if it continues to go up and to the right, is going to eventually reach your revenue line. And it's sort of a ne'er the twain shall meet, because once that happens, once how much you are spending to make the game reaches or crosses how much you're making, you have a serious problem. Now suddenly we're in a place where like, wait a minute, how do we get this down below? Because I'm no longer making money, I'm losing it, even if I have a big game that lots of people are playing. And so you have to do stuff to try to keep, I call it the red line and the green line. You got to try to keep the red line below the green line. Now, I answered your question from the perspective of live service. I think that's impacting a lot of the live service games right now, where they're trying to figure out, how do I run profitably while continuing to meet all the player needs? Now we go over to new game development. So new game development is inherently a risk. Most games fail. I joke that like it's easy to be Nostradamus in the games industry. All you have to do is just predict everything to fail, and you'll be right like 95 to 99% of the time. What you're doing then is you're playing a risky game. You're playing a long odds game, and you're trying to stack everything in your favor. How do you do that? I think we don't know how to do that. That's one of the problems for new game development. And I think when I look at the big games that have come out, I also say, wow, they were really expensive to make. Right. New game development, especially at the AAA level, has just, you look at like a cost of a AAA game 15 years ago compared to now, it's a huge delta, right? We've added a digit. And players we're not making that much more money from the players that play the game. And so to take it to new game development in the AAA space with major publishers and studios and things like that, you imagine in the old world, I'm going to spend, let's say 30, 40 million on a AAA game. Well, I spend some of that money. Not all those games succeed, but some of them do. The ones that do make back more than enough to cover the failures of the studios that don't make it. And I don't have to like lay off the studio that didn't make it necessarily. Maybe it was a good shot, but hey, most games fail. That's okay. Give them another chance. They try again. Now imagine a world where it's not 30 to 50 million. It's, 150 to 400 million.
Right.
Well, has player revenue in that I'll call it that AAA space gone up by that same amount over that period of time? Absolutely not. So now, when you get the occasional hit, which still happens, like Hogwarts Legacy popped out, Elden Ring popped out, there've been games that have hit in the last few years. Baldur's Gate 3, right? When you get one that hits, does it pay for everything else? Not really, not as much as it used to. And so I think that there's a problem in the portfolio, which is that we used to be able to rely on a couple big hits to make everything else okay and fund the company. And now suddenly you're no longer getting 10, 100x returns on a new game. You're getting 2 to 5 to 10. And so you can't fund as much as you used to be able to. So I think that's massively impacting the new game dev world when it comes to the big producers, like the big AAA companies, the giant studios. And then again, live service, you just have these two lines and you've got to be really careful with them. There's underlying trends there as well.
Yeah, and maybe we can also dig into some of the underlying trends, because it sounds like, and I agree with you, like costs are kind of getting out of control and costs have risen a lot. But would you say that that's the only major change in terms of like Western studios not being as successful as before? Or would you even agree that it does seem like when we look at the more recent hits, many of them are coming from China, for example? Is that
China,
really,
Japan, yep.
yeah, is that really just a cost issue, or do you think there might be other things at play?
So, great question. I don't think it's just a cost issue. I think it's highlighting something, which is we didn't really know what we were doing before, but we were able to paper over it.
Right.
And as again, the green line isn't as steep as we want, and the red line is steeper than we want. As costs start going above revenues, we're being forced to confront the fact that, wait a minute, the things that we do maybe don't work as well, and we have to do better. And that's where I do look at Japan and China, and I see them taking some different approaches. I'm not as familiar with some of those things,
Right.
but when I see games like Elden Ring or what Nintendo manages to do, like with their Zelda games, things like that, like they're doing something differently. They're approaching the problem in a different way.
Right.
Because and in the Western world, like how did we try to solve the problem of, well, we're constantly raising the bar on what a AAA game is. We focused heavily, like really heavily, on craft quality, individual craft quality. Does the art look really good? Is the design really strong? Is the audio just the best it could possibly be? There was a strong focus on visual fidelity, I think, as this measure of how good a game was. If you could have a really, really good looking game, then that meant that game was more likely to be wildly successful or something. And there's probably some truth to that, but if the fundamental game isn't any good, it doesn't matter how pretty it is. If no one wants to play the core loop. And so, but to get to that extra little bit of quality takes more and more time. And so you see timelines for big games have gone up. Again, not that long ago, 2 to 3 years, that's what it took you to make a AAA game. Nowadays, it's not uncommon to see dev cycles sitting between 5 and 10 years.
Right.
Cost to developer, size of team. I mean, how many games 15 years ago had a 400-person team working on them before release? Right. It was like, no, it didn't happen. That would be ridiculous. So time to develop has gone up, cost to developer has gone up, and total number of developers has gone up. This means that, again, we see this huge increase in cost, and it's revealing something, which is I don't think, we are not focusing on what actually makes a game great. Right. We thought that it was just, the thing I've heard so much is like, oh, if we just get all the best people and we put them in a room to make a game, that'll make the best game. I don't believe that's true. And where I'll pick on Japan specifically with some of, again, their bigger successes. I'm sure they've had plenty of failures too, but with Nintendo's and like FromSoft and some of those things, when I see what they're doing is they're actually less concerned in some ways about visual fidelity and more concerned about delivering an experience. And that's their focus. And they do have more of a, we'll give it the time it needs to be ready approach than often in the West. We screw ourselves up by setting somewhat arbitrary deadlines around when something absolutely has to ship. to hit particular windows or whatever. And I feel like there are companies both in the West, but especially in the East, that are like, it's not ready yet. We're not going to do
Right.
that.
So not to oversimplify, but it does seem like the main arguments that you're making for a lot of, and maybe we can say Western studios having a greater number of failures is just the increase in production costs, as well as in probably an overemphasis on production quality versus other aspects of game
Yeah.
design or development that could potentially allow these games to be successful. And from my perspective, I also think that there were a couple of macro trends that also are are basically leading to more failures. One of which is just that the rise of live operated games, right? And so whether
Yes.
it's like a League of Legends or a Valorant or a Fortnite, like trying to steal time from those games is very difficult because you've already got these really incredible games with a really fantastic core loop that's really just sucking in the players. And so to get them off of those games, you
Yeah.
really need to, from my perspective, provide a differentiated experience rather than the same experience at that never-ending race towards higher production quality. So I don't
Yeah.
know if you would agree with that. But also, the one other thing too is that we've also seen just a proliferation of new game development as well. Like you can see the number of new games launched on Steam. I mean, it's going up like crazy.
Yeah. Oh man, 19,000 last year.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Which was like a 30% increase from the previous.
But
Yeah.
I think the good news, though, is that what we're seeing is one, we're seeing some success from China where there's something that they're doing. Maybe it's a cost issue, maybe it's something else, but they seem to be having more success than the US or Western studios. And I would say that we've also seen kind of like really small developers. So whether it's Valheim, BattleBit, Lethal Company, we've seen like these games that are actually able to achieve a lot of success on very low production budgets and with very small teams that have kind of somehow been able to figure things out. And I think it's because we have people that really understand the player well and are not kind of going towards, we just want to make the same thing but higher production quality with maybe a different theme.
Yeah. No, I agree with all that. When I see like a PAL World or something like that, where with a very small budget, and even it's something that's interesting to me is like what makes a studio a AAA studio, because did people consider Larian AAA prior to Baldur's Gate 3? Probably not, right? Divinity Original Sin 1, Divinity Original Sin 2. Some people might say, well, it's just pure budget size. That's what makes you AAA. But the thing is, this: how do you define the studio? Now, does everybody view BG3 as this AAA game and Larian as this AAA studio? Absolutely. Why? They had a huge success. Did they have a huge success because they were triple? No. The success happened to hit. And why did it hit? And I actually got to talk to a couple people on their team, and they were so focused, to your point, around understanding who the player was and what would actually work for this, and how do we really deliver this fantasy we're creating, this fantasy world? How do we make this so compelling? And again, not the focus on, is this all pixel perfect or is it the most realistic we could, anything like that. And also not, I think, focused on what's all the stuff we could throw into this, but what's the overall experience we're trying to create. That felt like it just rained at that studio. And I see that at many of the studios, and even like small, the solo dev efforts like Lethal Company. There's an experience that is trying to be created.
Right.
And the focus is on that experience for the player. And if I can nail that, then everything else I can solve later. Once my game is wildly successful, if I want to, I can do a V2 and it'll have better graphics. But we get the cart before the horse, I think, a bit in the West, and we lose the vision, or we don't have a clear vision at many of those big studios. And I had a conversation with a guy named Graham McAllister. He's very worth talking to, and you should go check him out. He's writing a book right now about game vision, and I agree with him on this. The number one problem we're seeing in game development is that if you go in and ask all the developers working on a game, do you know what game you're making? You get all kinds of different answers. Some people will just say, I don't.
The alignment problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a fundamental alignment problem, and who's responsible for that but the leadership of that studio to say, no, this is the game we're making, this is what it is, this is what it isn't. When I've heard people describe Sven over at Larian for Baldur's Gate 3, he did that. I think Arrowhead's another example of like Helldivers 2. Where'd that come from? There was a game called Helldivers because Helldivers 2 clearly had a prequel, and that game did okay. It was fine, but it was a small studio, you know. And then suddenly, boom, Helldivers 2 is out, and now again, whoa, what a massive hit! All these different things, and this is where I agree with your assessment. And a lot of people have been talking about this idea of like, look, there's a single-digit percentage of time that all new games are fighting for, and there's a lot more new games. And by the way, it's not just you're not just fighting with the 19,000 other games on Steam and the however many, way more than that, games that come out on mobile. You're also fighting with like Roblox and UEFN and like game, like all these are sucking time. And I was thinking about this a lot the last couple of weeks. And one of the things I would say is, hey, we got to be careful about, you know, I've heard the number like 6%. You're fighting for like 6 or 6.5%, right? But let's just say it's a single digit percentage. The reality is that if nobody made any games, then all the old games would get 100%. You're not fighting for the 6.5%. You're fighting to expand the percentage of new games that people spend time on.
Right.
That's what you're doing when you're making a new game. And next year, if everybody that was making a new game did a really good job, maybe it would be 20% or 30%, because everybody would be drawn away from those games to play these new amazing experiences. Now, if we do see a stable number there over time, you might say it's hard to move that number. But the other thing is you don't need to move that number a ton, because 6% is a lot. Like 6.5% is a lot of hours, a lot of money spent, a lot of players enjoying themselves with that, whatever your new experience is. So I get like it's, you know, when you look at it at that macro level, there absolutely is, I think Matthew Bell called them like black hole games where people just get sucked in, like players are just sucked in. They're like, this is the game I'm going to play.
Right.
And I'll be honest, if you were to tell me right now, like, hey, what kind of game should I try to make? Part of me goes, make a game that players will play, enjoy, and then move on from.
Yeah,
because
right. It's an interesting point that you're raising, because I think I know the statistics you're talking about, which was the statistics released by Steam about the percentage of players that play games that are of a certain vintage age. Right.
Yeah.
So like new games in the previous year versus 3+ years old, or even 6+ years old, and it was pretty dramatic in terms of how few players. And I remember the number being more like 8%, but whatever that number is.
Yeah,
small,
somewhere in there.
But to your point, I think that's kind of a pessimistic interpretation, because to some degree, that if you create a new kind of game experience, I think it can expand the audience for it. I actually think that Path of Exile 2 is a good example of this, where there weren't a lot of people playing these kind of like ARPG, Diablo-like games. I mean, there was an audience, but it seems like Path of Exile 2 seems to have expanded the audience, where a lot of my friends and people I know who typically weren't Diablo players are now into that game a lot.
Yeah. Yes.
And just to kind of circle all the way back to the original question, we talked about problems in the industry and then also problems in terms of production and execution. I would also argue that maybe what we're seeing in terms of problems in the West, as far as the lack of success, is also tied to the way in which we do production. There's and this is kind of a Pandora's box in terms of why, or what are the specific issues. You mentioned alignment. I also think to some degree, because the bigger, one of the impacts of the trend that you talked about in terms of having bigger and bigger budgets is that now all the business guys, when we're talking about 100 million, 200 million plus budgets, all these business guys start getting involved. The MBAs who will tell you what can be greenlit and what can't be greenlit. And from the MBA perspective of what's low risk or high risk, and show me that this innovative game design is going to be successful. Show me the data that proves that, right? And it's like asking, like if someone like that were to try to approve Lethal Company or some of these other games, it'd be very hard to prove.
Yes. There's a smaller publisher, by the way, named Hooded Horse. They did Manor Lords, Across the Storm, a few, and one of the things that's fascinating about them is they're actually making these smaller bets, and they're doing them really smartly. Not all their games are hits, but some of them are, and they're doing all these like really smart tactical bets, and I think it's a very intelligent strategy. for right now. But yes, you're correct. You're correct. Like we see scale, we see 200 million, we have expectations.
Right. But I think to some degree, even with like a, let's say, Path of Exile 2, I would argue that Grinding Gears basically outdid Blizzard in making a Diablo-like game, right? And so to some degree, if you have a great team, I think regardless of kind of like the general direction, I think you can still make a successful game. And I wanted to maybe also talk about, for some games, you just never make it because you have so many problems in production that you don't actually even get a game out. In addition to the other problems you mentioned as far as like alignment and whether the design is right or things like that. But maybe we can kind of shift to this issue around production problems. So you've been advising a number of studios, and I'd love to hear from you. What are the most common problems that you've been facing in your capacity in advisory, whether it's a leadership problem or whether it's specific production issues? What are the top, let's say, 2 or 3 problems that you've encountered?
So I'm going to answer this. I'm going to sort of tear this down because I've been thinking about this question a lot. And like, what is it? If I were to go and advise, I'm going to put a root, and this is very multivariate, but I'm going to put a main root as how comfortable are you with the uncertainty that is part of game development? If you have low comfort with uncertainty, I hope you're working on like a sequel somewhere or a live service game. Because if you're doing anything new, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And especially as leaders. And so then I go, okay, so I want to know what your comfort with uncertainty is. Then I want to know what's the quality of your leadership team, and specifically them. How comfortable are they with that uncertainty? I think all the problems that I'm going to list relate to uncertainty, and they relate to leadership. And so those are the 2 underlying things. And that a leader's job, you can view the leader's job through different roles. One thing I think that leaders do is they resolve the uncertainty of those they lead. That's not why they're there necessarily. I don't define leadership that way, but it is something that they do. They resolve the uncertainty of those they lead. And the question is how? And I think a lot of leaders in game development attempt to resolve the uncertainty by pretending it doesn't exist, or by acting as though it doesn't exist, or by saying, well, I'll just say that this is true now, so it will be true, and then we will no longer be uncertain. And when you see that across an organization, everybody might feel better in the moment of like, oh, whew, we've got a plan now. Someone made a choice. Okay, got it. That uncertainty's out of the way. But maybe you've just failed to accept reality, right, which is far more important than just having a plan we can all get on the same page about.
Why do you think that happens though, Ben? I mean, I have my own theory, which is like, I think it's because of fear. But what do you think?
That's it. For me, it's absolutely... So there's this question around like what motivates human beings. Are we motivated by wanting to thrive as much as we can? Yeah, kind of. Not actually as much as you'd think. We're motivated to not die. We prefer avoidance of pain to thriving.
Right.
And so when a lot of people, and this is like how you see people behave, I act in a way that puts me in a sometimes not great environment, but that at least it's comfortable, I'm familiar with it, and I don't have too much pain anywhere in my life. And what we're actually optimizing there for is the reduction of anxiety. And uncertainty is a huge driver of anxiety for human beings. It's not the only one, but it's like the more uncertain things are, the more our brains are trying to solve that uncertainty and figure out like, wait a minute, uncertainty is threat, which makes a lot of sense, if you go back through time. So the more certain I can make things, the more control I have of the environment, the more I will be okay. And that's actually what so many people optimize for. They think they're trying to be happy. They're not. They're just trying not to be in pain. They're trying not to suffer.
Right.
So I think that's where that uncertainty at a base level comes from. And if people can't look at their own lives and reflect on that and understand that, one of the problems is that it's happening anyway. It's happening in the background and it's impacting these leaders. So that's my ideas. Exactly. And by the way, fear is just one of those, like anxiety is a whole plethora of emotions.
Yeah.
And fear is one way that manifests.
Yeah. Kind of like fear and maybe even pride, right? Which is to say that on the fear side, I can't name how many times working with a game designer, and it's very clear what the biggest design problem is. And it's like, okay, we have a major design problem, but they're solving every other little thing around it. It's like, why aren't you solving this?
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, because then, I don't know if I can solve that problem. But it's so important to address your biggest risks first. And then I think also from a studio leadership perspective, whether it's talking to investors or if you're in a company talking to, like a publishing team or higher ups, and admitting, hey, we screwed up, we're in trouble, to show weakness rather than, hey, everything's fine. And,
Yes.
It's almost like, somebody described it to me once as like, some of these, from an investment perspective, as well as you could apply this to game studios, is like, there's a bird flying in the sky and all of a sudden it just drops out of the sky and dies. And because you never knew it was in trouble because no one wanted to admit that this is a project in trouble. But I think,
go ahead.
Oh, well,
I was going to say, go ahead.
So I was also going to say, ironically, in my experience as an old guy working on a bunch of different game projects, it seems like the pattern that I've seen is that the game projects with the most problems, where people were yelling and screaming at each other, where people had to be let go, where there were so many issues and problems, those were the most successful games. And the games where we hit every deadline and we launched and the game just went whoop all the way to zero, right?
Yeah.
It seems like the studios, and my theory on this is that the reason why that has been the case, at least in my experience, has been that it's those studios that have the kind of culture where they care, they're having direct conversations, and they're addressing big problems, versus the studios that try to hide the problems, sweep them under the rug, and you launch with those problems.
Yes. I've seen a similar pattern, and I don't know if I was like, hey, it's not like the most, let me go create the most dysfunctional studio I possibly can, so that I can be successful. Like, no. But it is this idea of the fact that uncertainty exists, and I think it's inherent to game development, doesn't mean you don't try to resolve it. The question is how. And one of the best ways to resolve it is to be comfortable with a conflict that different perspectives on the same thing might bring.
Right.
And so when, I have a model, and one of my principles, I mentioned this earlier, is accept reality. You want everybody in the studio focused on accepting reality. You want the leaders encouraging people to accept reality and say the hard things. The problem is when you say the hard things, they're hard for a reason. If it was, I've said this recently to someone else, but if it was easy to do the right thing, like morally or ethically or whatever, like for the good of the people around you, then we wouldn't celebrate it as much as we do. It's hard to do the right thing. It's why it's a big deal when you see someone so consistently do the right thing. And because we recognize that they're taking a risk. Because if I do the right thing and I call out problems, big problems in a studio or a team in an R&D environment inside of a big publisher or something, I go in and I'm like, hey, I see some big problems here. There are not a few studios that will immediately eject me from that organization for pointing out the issues.
Absolutely.
And I think to your point, a lot of those studios are going to go on to hit every milestone, make every little thing, justify every mistake without actually admitting it was a mistake, and they're going to ship something that's terrible. There's this question, and I pick on Concord so much I feel bad, but I mean, gosh, what an example in our industry.
Mistake.
Yeah, exactly. Like you look at that, you go, are you telling me nobody in that studio knew there was a problem? And I know that's not true because I've talked to people who were close to that studio.
Right.
There were people that knew there was a problem there. Were they able to talk about that problem, explain that problem, challenge what was going on? Not really. By the way, I've heard also people have given Sony a hard time. I've heard Sony was an amazing publisher for that game. They gave them money, runway, time, space. They were like, we're here for you. We want to support you. I mean, I don't know, like right at the end, there's probably a bit different, but it wasn't like Sony was in there all the time meddling from what I've heard. They did what they're supposed to do. We had the smart people making the game and we backed off and we let them work.
Right.
What happened? And I think it's what you said. Were we able to have the hard conversations? And so there's two things. You mentioned pride. I think pride's one. I think the other that can look like pride, and it'll manifest in a very similar way, is it's kind of like imposter syndrome, but it's basically I want to be perceived as competent, and I'm worried I won't be, and so I have to hide things. I have to protect myself.
Yep.
And honestly, I can say that most of the people, myself included, I struggle with pride quite a bit. Most of the people that I've found who are prideful, or have a lot of proudness that they have to use, it's almost always a shield for their own insecurity. Not exclusively. There's some people that I think are just that I'm the best. And I don't want them on my team, generally speaking. But there's a lot of the pride is a shield. The pride is protecting me from my own insecurity. If I don't know, like you said, I don't know how to solve this. I don't know how to solve this, so I'll solve everything I know how to solve, and I'll ignore the biggest problem. And I think that that just is. It is across our industry. It is in a lot of these big companies with their very senior leaders. We know what's going on. No, you don't. And it's not like it's bad that you don't know. It would be fine if you could admit you don't know, because then you could actually embrace that uncertainty and go through the problems and the disagreements and the arguments and the tests, and you would frame your whole development differently around not seeing game development as a step-by-step process to get to the end point, but as an experimentation of what will be a good time for the player? What will engage them? What will make them want to come back and play our game more and tell their friends this was a great game, you should go play it too? We're not answering the right questions. So this kind of gets me all the way around to what are the big three things? So I said uncertainty, leadership, how they relate to uncertainty, that sets the culture.
Yep.
Three things. First one we already talked about, vision, not having an aligned vision, not knowing what a vision is. And a vision is not a statement somebody made once that told us what the game was. It's got to be living, and the leaders all have to be, just to your point, arguing about it, and then aligning on okay, this is the path, okay, this is the path, and then disseminating that throughout the organization so we can all go in the same direction. Number two for me is what I'd call the rush to production. Well, we got a big budget. We're supposed to be finishing up ideation according to some arbitrary roadmap somebody made at some point in the past. I guess it's time to hire more people and justify a bigger budget. Sometimes this is because a VC is pushing. Not always, but sometimes VCs push for you got to be growing. You got to be we want the next round to increase our relative value. And so the bigger you are, the more we can claim that you're worth more. And so we rush in the VC side. In the R&D side on large publishers or larger studios, what you'll see is I have to get through the next gate. Once I get through the next gate, it unlocks money for me. And you'll see, I just read a great post, an article written by a guy named Jonathan Zabel, and he described his mindset when he was leading a game was I'm just supposed to get to the next gate. I'm just supposed to get to the next gate, because every gate I unlock more money and more, I can make my team bigger and all this different stuff. And so in almost every area, you get this rush to production, to the production phase is what I mean there. If you think about ideation, pre-production, production, post-production, sustainment. If you think about those phases, you're rushing to get to production. And again, I think this ties into that uncertainty. I think it's because when we're in production, things are supposed to be certain, because we got a lot of people and we're executing against the known vision. And so we want to get there, because if we just lock everything down, even though it actually is wrong, like you said, we're bringing our problems with us forward. This rush to production makes us pretend, or helps us to pretend that don't worry, we know what's going on. We're in production now. And so you asked about some of my experiences. I've seen over 100-person studios working on games that didn't have functional core loops.
Yep.
And I'm sure you've seen this too. And you go in and you ask them, you go in and you ask them well, wait a minute, tell me what your game is. And they're like, oh, well, it's my always example is it's Master Chief Halo crossed with Candy Crush. And I'm like, what does that mean? Why is that fun? How does that work? Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, well, we're still figuring that out. And I'm like, well, where are you in development? They're like, we're in production, and I'm watching them produce production quality assets. I'm like, you don't know what your game is. And yet you have over 100 people out here doing a lot of stuff. And the challenge with this rush to production, this scaling too fast, if I need to pivot my game because I learned something, it is exponentially easier to pivot a 5-person or 10-person team than it is to pivot a 30, 50, 70, 100-person team. That is a months-long exercise of like, okay, how are we going to message it? Like, how are we going to go through the hierarchy of our organization? All these different things. You can do that. You can work on doing that faster, but the reality is that once you get to a certain scale, it becomes hard to pivot. You know, it's that always like, are you a dinghy or are you the Titanic? Both have advantages, but the Titanic couldn't turn. And it sunk. And that's where a lot of you are headed if you become a Titanic before your core game is in a good state. So I think that there's a lot of pressure pushing leaders to rush to production, to rush to scale, to get too many people on the boat way too fast. And that makes everything way harder. They don't acknowledge that. They just pretend that they know more than they do. And then, they end up in production. And I think this is what happened with things like Anthem and Concord. I never knew, like, why would someone keep playing this game? I don't know. It kind of all works together. It's like, that's not good enough in the modern world. You can't just have a game that kind of works and have that be good enough.
Right. And I think that, so in my experience, I can't even remember a time where we actually had a really great pre-production phase in game development. And I've worked on many, many game projects. And I think to a large degree, what you're saying is a root cause, but I think there's other issues as well, because I have been on teams with game leads who are relatively humble and who would not rush to production just to show that we're not in trouble. I think there's other pressures and factors at work there, but
yeah. Well, I can list one.
Sure.
You have a limited budget, and we're making a game. Somebody is doing the intelligent thing and tracking how much money we have versus where we're supposed to be. When you scale up, you increase burn rate, but you also move towards a ship.
Yeah.
If we endlessly iterate in ideation, we will eventually run out of money or the patience of our stakeholders, depending on your context. And I think that for many of these studios, they are looking at that runway and going like, I mean, we don't really have a choice. We have to be in pre-production. We have to be in production now. Like we just have to make a call and go.
Right.
And even someone who's aware of these traps might go like, I accept the trap. I take the risk. We're going to make the best decision we know in the moment, and we're going to hope it works. And this comes back to, I think all of game development is not, how do I make a sure thing? You can't. Best thing you can do is stack the odds in your favor. And someone who made a game that didn't work out, they did something very hard by shipping a game in the first place, but it's also not like, well, they must all be bad at their job because their game didn't work. This is hard. This is incredibly difficult. And there's no test environment you have that mirrors the reality. So that's one thing I would say is like, there's a pragmatic dollar-based or monetary, like how much you have in the bank will determine when you might need to go forward in order to achieve what you're trying to achieve.
I'm just thinking out loud, but I think maybe another issue that does happen at times is that even if you've characterized what your hypothesis of a workable core loop is and characterized it well, and you move into production, you may realize later, especially with external player validation and things like that, that maybe you were wrong. And so now you're in production with a false thesis.
Yep.
And so then then what do you do then?
Yeah.
Do you just stop? We're going to lay off 3/4 of the team and go back to pre-production? Or what do you do, right?
Yes, exactly. And by the way, I don't have an answer to that question. I think that there is the brutal answer that is what you just said, which is like, oh shoot, our core thesis is not valid.
Right.
Well, it's time to go back to ideation. And like, whoa, again, that is it's very difficult to do that while maintaining all that extra staff that is going to be both crushing your burn rate, and need to be aligned at every step of the way. So I think that there are times where, maybe the right call would be like, I'm sorry, we weren't ready, and that's a mistake we made. But to save the studio and to save the game idea, or really rediscover it, we have to go back to a smaller team. that's not a popular opinion, but that might be the right move for everybody involved versus like, well, let's just hope we manage to solve it in production. I mean,
Right.
how much does that happen? Like, and how many times does that work out? Like, it's not that's a lower, again, thinking about the odds and stacking the odds, it's a lower odds play. A third one, so I talked about
Yep.
vision.
Hmm.
I talked about scaling too fast, basically, again, the rush to production.
Yep.
I think a third one is the obsession with planning that we have. We want to know, and by the way, conceding that you do have so much money in the bank, you do want to roughly try to understand how it's being spent and at what point you should probably be at what phase and how that's going to shift, like, when you hire people and these sorts of things. That is a relevant factor. I'm not saying you don't do planning, but man, I see us go and basically pretend that game development is this known quantity where all we need to do is like build the right widgets, build the right pieces, put them together. The analogy I use is like you're a bunch of people and you're making car parts, and whenever you finish one, someone like opens the garage door and tosses it into the garage, and they're just like, oh, I'll just here's another car part, here's another car part, and then you like at some point you go around and you open up the garage door, and you were expecting to see a Ferrari or at least like a Pinto or something in there. And instead it's just like a pile of parts and there's 3 steering wheels and 7 tires and like there's no suspension. And I think we do this more than we realize, which is we focus heavily on the stuff of games. And that's, by the way, something that I think there's an overlap there with the scale. We scale so that we can build more stuff. Well, why are you building this stuff? Do you know? And I think often the answer is I don't actually know. I just know I'm supposed to build this stuff. And so, this is easier at bigger companies with more money who can hire more talent because they think like, oh, the problem is how are we going to get it all done in time? It's like, that's not the problem. The problem is how is it going to be something that players want to play in time? And if you reframe that slightly, it's a value focus to the player rather than, well, just let's make sure we have more NPCs or more assets or more weapons or more this. Like that's not it. That won't make your game succeed. If Concord had more characters and more weapons and more maps, would it have been a successful game? No. And so I think there's also this obsession with those plans, the obsession of trying to break it all down, and then pretending, again, accept reality. We pretend that those plans are actually going to play out. We go into this fiction like you described of like we're hitting every milestone. Are you really? Were your milestones a bunch of assets created? Because if so, I understand. You made a plan that was a bunch of assets created at every step. You managed to make all those assets so you thought you were winning, and nobody ever went and said like, wait, what kind of car is this going to be? Do we need 3 mufflers? Maybe we don't. So those are the big 3 I see. There's a fourth that is not. It's not production directly, but I like to throw it out there. And engineers will appreciate this. Everything we do in games is built on code. It's a bunch of different code stacks. Whether you're using an engine and you never touch code as a development team, or like you're in Roblox or whatever, it's like it's all, you're interacting with it through a different format. It's all code. How quickly and easily can your devs build new things and test them and understand if they're good or not? The faster they can do that, the faster you can mine through the uncertainty that is around you and actually get real answers and reduce that in a healthy way, not artificially. The slower that is, the harder it's going to be. And I still hear horror stories, absolute horror stories about iteration cycles and like what it takes to release a test build and all this different stuff. And the harder you make that stuff, the less it's going to happen. And so again, this isn't necessarily production directly, but this would be like my fourth one, is you have to take the fact that all of video games are built on code and that it's like a giant engineering effort. You have to take that seriously. If your artist's tools are terrible and art is an important part of your game, that's a serious problem. If it takes forever to build an environment or a new level because the tools just take forever to compile and break all the time, and you have like an entire team of tech artists who just try to troubleshoot all the issues that happen because you can't afford a team to go and like actually improve the tool set. These things all play a big role in slowing down the resolution of the uncertainty and the alignment, again, the sort of maintaining that vision, like moving towards the right vision. So anyway, that would be it. So vision, scaling too quickly, obsession with plans over value, plans over prioritization might be one way to say it, and then not building a healthy technical stack that your teams can operate off of.
Right. And maybe we could dive into a little bit more nuance on your third major issue
Yeah.
around planning, because I do feel like part of the issue where planning goes off the rails is a few potential sources. So if we were to like root cause analyze some of the issues that major studios have when it comes to why is the planning wrong?
Mm-hmm.
I would say from my experience, it could have been like, for example, we talked about the potential scenario in which you had an initial thesis behind the game, you're in production, it turns out that thesis is wrong, but then maybe you also realize that the person is wrong, that the vision holder that was behind that thesis is not the right person. And maybe like whether it's a genre or there's a specific issue. So then what happens when you don't have the right person, the tastemaker making the decisions? You don't have the Steve Jobs or the Joni Ive telling you exactly what to make. Then you're just trying a bunch of different things. You don't know how to direct the design of the game, for example. And I also think that the other thing in terms of what could derail the plans could be around, are you making the right decisions? We're going to focus on this area, not this area, but maybe this was a more important issue.
Yes.
And I think from my experience, it feels like so many studios, because of the pressures of production and budgets, and because of the sheer number of people involved, that I really do feel like there are so few game studios that do proper decision analysis. Like, okay, we're going to focus on this. Why?
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, because of this. And it's and the way that I describe it is kind of like that. I don't know, the parable or the story of the elephant and the 5 blind guys who are touching different parts of the.
Oh yeah.
And there may be different aspects to identifying what this thing is. It's an elephant, but everyone has like, they may be saying, well, we're making this decision because of this or this or this, but they don't have the whole picture.
Right.
You may be making a suboptimal decision, or the thinking behind the decision that is made is like, there's just not enough time spent on it. But I also want to get your take on this, Ben.
Yeah.
When the planning and the schedule goes off, what are some of the other things that you see? Do you agree with some of those issues that I've raised? And
yeah. Oh yeah. So the first one I think is more actually about the vision. Really, it's like what happens when the vision collapses. What do you do? And especially if you don't have the Jobsian figure who's like, I'm holding it. Because I don't think you need a Steve Jobs. I know game studios have been successful without that one person who is trying to hold it all in their game. And in fact, that brings with it a set of risks that, like, if they're wrong, you're all wrong.
and they add a little bit of nuance there. So because I think you can have alignment, but the alignment is wrong because the person is wrong.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right. So that's the I call this the creative auteur model.
Okay.
Is there's one person who's the creative auteur, and it's their job to have the whole game in their head, and the work of production is to like get the game out of their head and into a plan. I don't like this model at all, because of what you just said. If they're wrong, we're wrong. Period. Now, some games have been very successful with this model. But I think there's a blend you can do. I think you do need leaders who are vision holders, and they are looking at the plan and going, I or we have an understanding of what this game should be. And we are thinking about what the most important parts of it are and are not. And this is where I said it's a prioritization versus planning. Our job as leaders isn't necessarily to make sure it's all planned out. And the production team's job isn't necessarily to make sure it's all planned out. It's to make sure that we are focusing on the most important things that we know of today. And ideally, we're testing those things. We're validating that those are actually the most important things over time. So as we start making the game, the first thing you're asking isn't like, well, what are all the things I'm going to do in pre-production or something like that? It's, what is the most important question or problem I have to solve for the player of this game to make it more compelling? And then what would I need to add to whatever that solution was? Like, what are the things I would need to build? And the thing is, you ask the question earlier in development, in ideation and pre-production, and you solve it by building that stuff, usually in production. It's not to say you won't ask questions in production, you will. They should be smaller questions. If you get a giant question in production that's, like you said, a world where we're in production and suddenly realize our core thesis is bad, that actually, to me, immediately means you're no longer in production. And so how do you determine all those things? It's the judgment of the leaders who are responsible for holding that vision. Again, be it one or several. So that was the first one. What was the second thing you brought up? Because I remember I agreed with that as well.
One was like having the right person, and then second is the decision analysis, like making the right decisions.
Yes. Again, to me, this is a prioritization question.
Okay.
All aspects of process, to include planning and estimation and prioritization, all these different things, all they're there to do is to help people make good decisions. You can think of, like, I think of work systems as a whole as they're primarily there to solve alignment problems, and they're secondarily there to solve, or to really help people build relationships with each other. That's it. You're trying to get alignment and relationships. What you choose to align on will depend on what you do with the process, and what relationships you build will depend on who you put in the room at the same time and how they end up working together and all these different things. But that's what you're trying to do. Why is it important to do that? Because if we're not aligned, then we'll make contradictory decisions to each other. And this is one of those things where my military background, on a battlefield, the wrong decision made violently and fast can often be better than the right decision made too late.
Yep.
Now, we do have more time, fortunately, than a battlefield, and the stakes are also fortunately lower, but the same principle can apply. If you're all going together in a direction, you're likely to have more success, even if it's not a great direction. Now, it's also possible you just run yourselves off a cliff, and that's going to happen too. But it wasn't like us all going in different directions, but somebody being right someday was a better option. And this is, again, you're stacking the odds with all this. And I think prioritization instead of planning is a way to do that. The interesting thing is once you prioritize, you can then plan, but you recognize that your prioritization of what's most valuable for the player is how we evaluate whether we're being successful or not percentage of assets completed or percentage through phase whatever. That is less important than did we actually meet the need. And one of the reasons plans so often fail, they don't take that into serious consideration. I remember making a huge plan. It was a big project, environment related. And like it was going to take a while to get done, but we thought, somewhere 6 months or whatever. It ended up taking way longer than that. And there was this breakdown that the leads did of like how long each asset should take to make. And their thought was, if I can just make all the assets, then we'll be done. The problem is you try to make an asset and then you go talk to stakeholders and then they're like, oh, that's kind of cool, but I'd like this different, or I'd like that different, or I'd like this different. And you go back and you have to remake the asset. Well, you only put time in the schedule for one shot at that thing. And you buffered it a little bit. You thought like, well, maybe sometime we'll have to like redo some stuff. But what you don't realize is you're gonna have to not just redo everything, most likely, or almost everything. You're also gonna have to continue to realign everybody around why. And all of that takes time. And so you go through this process when you're actually building something of not just like a feature shows up on an engineer's desk and through Jira or Favro or whatever, and he's like, okay, or she's, like, let me just run through this. I'm going to build my feature. Oh, it's done. I move on to the next. No, you have to, okay, cool. Feature shows up. Who do I need to talk to know why exactly what this feature is for and how it's supposed to help the player? So this designer, okay, I'm going to go talk to that designer. Let me go talk to hi designer. What's going on with this thing? Oh, I was thinking this, blah, 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 blah. We start talking about it. Oh, that's not quite what I was thinking about. Okay, that'll probably take a different amount of time than I originally thought. Let's go back. I'll start working on it. I start building it. You start testing it. We find out, not quite right. Okay, it doesn't feel good. You do this a couple of times. Suddenly your plan is so far out of date that it's like irrelevant to the project overall, outside of confusing everybody, and especially senior stakeholders who are going like, wait, I thought the plan said blah and blah, I was going to be done by now. And you're like, no, we haven't even started those. We're still trying to figure out this one. We're like, well, wait, that was supposed to take 2 weeks. Like, we're 3 months in. What's going on? It's like, well, we've been aligning around what's important. Your plan's screwed. But if you're focused on the prioritization, that is a shared understanding you have of, look, until we can solve the most important thing for the game, building a ton more stuff actually doesn't help us.
Right.
Being higher percentage through the plan from an asset perspective is less valuable than being further through the player experience as a compelling, engaging thing emotionally hook them or to help them get into puzzle solve, whatever it is you're trying to do with the player, why they would continue to play your game.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of call that the ooh problem at our studio, which is like, there's like, we haven't even finished the core loop and all these guys are like, oh, I got an idea. We should do this.
Yep.
And I literally have to say, guys, shut the fuck up. We are doing this first. You have to earn the right for your fucking ooh idea.
Yeah.
We get the core in first.
Yes.
Until then, write down your ideas. You can share it. We're not doing any of that shit. Once we've finished, now we talk about those ideas.
Yeah, and see that what you're describing is, the classic like scope creep of, I've got in the military we had this idea, the good idea fairy.
Mm-hmm.
The good idea fairy was someone usually hit somebody at the staff level in brigade. So this was someone who was like reasonably up the hierarchy, like a major or something like that, and they were operating in a world where they were somewhat disconnected from the reality on the ground, and they would have a good idea like, oh, it would be really good. I think I'll give some real examples that just drove me crazy when I was in Afghanistan. Or I'll give one real example. We need to make sure that we trim basically the hedge. We trim the grass and the growth around certain buildings on a base in a war zone. That's really important. And I was just like, I don't have a lot of time over here, and you're asking me to basically give my soul. I had one soldier working with me in my shop at that time, and we were pretty distributed. You want me to be sending him out to go basically trim the hedge so that we look, our administration and logistics operations center looks nicer. Because it wasn't like, oh, the weeds are going to interfere with, it was just like, no, we just want to look, we want it to like look professional and we want to be disciplined and all. Right. I'm like, we are in a war zone. I do not care about the weeds coming out of the side of this Connex box that I happen to call my office. Right. But they had to go do it. And so there's this idea in the military, like the good idea fair, and it's that person who always has like, wait, wouldn't it be cool if? And then they go off and it's scope creep. And it's like everybody who's actually on the ground is like, what? No, please stop having ideas. Like just stop having ideas. We have, life and death decisions we're making every day. Yeah. I don't want to have an extra form I need to fill out so that, it's supposed to save somebody somewhere time.
Right. I think it's, to your point, it's scope creep. And then maybe a level of additional nuance is also what I call biggest fire, right? Like even within the feature list or list of things that you need to do, there are inherently going to be some things that are more important than the others.
Yes.
And too many times people want to work on some of these things, but it's like, no, this is most important. We got to work on this first, and then you move down the stack.
Yes, exactly. And that's where what you're describing is like, hey, we will find out if we need that later. In order for us to understand if that's even worthwhile, we have to actually have a core loop.
Yeah.
Like, let's prove or disprove the core loop, and then let's move over to doing that other thing. Ryan Scott, I worked with him on the champion team on League of Legends for a while. I loved it. He just said it very simply. He's like, ideas are waste. And we think they're not because we're like, it's just ideas. But they fill up time. They fill up brain space. People go have conversations about them. They think about it. And he's like, look, I'm not saying I can stop my designers from having ideas. He was the lead designer. But we have to recognize that ideas are waste because I cannot ship ideas. I can only ship what I make.
Right.
And so, yeah, you prioritize what's most important. You get everybody focused on that. If you get really good at doing that, the cool thing is you will actually get to more of those other good ideas. But if you are constantly distracted and split, like, let's say you have a big live service team because your game is successful. One of the obnoxious things, even though it's very helpful, is when you create a stack list of all the teams and what they're working on, because somebody's at the bottom. And it doesn't mean you have to shut that team down. Maybe they're all doing stuff that's worth investing people and resources in. But it's probably helpful to know that the team, I won't give an example, but that there's a team out there that has people on it that is less important than all the other teams on the game. And probably doesn't feel great when they hear that, like, hey, just so you know, you're the least important. Simultaneously, you are more important than all the other teams that don't exist that could exist. So you're still relatively important. We did choose to fund you. But the reason I need you to know this is because if you start having a big problem, I might not be that concerned because you're working on low priority stuff relative to everybody else. And when a high priority thing gets into big trouble, do not rush to this solution because you will absolutely ruin your studio. But you can look at the lower priority teams and say, is there anybody on those lower priority teams that can help the higher priority thing get done or be solved or whatever? When you don't do that prioritization stack and you just assume and pretend that all the teams are equal value, which is never true, you can't. It's much harder to have those conversations. And I've been on the highest priority team at the company, and I've been on much lower priority teams. And when I first moved from the highest priority team to the much lower priority team, I was like, wait a minute, why do we keep giving our resources away? And I was working with someone named Jessica Nam. She's a great producer. She never actually answered that question. She just kept giving our engineers away. Some of our best engineers, she kept giving them to other projects. And I realized after not too long a time, I was like, wait a minute, she's doing the right thing. She's helping the game succeed. And I'm here trying to make sure I get my stuff done for my relatively lower priority thing. Now, maybe you think your thing is higher priority. That's fine. You can have that debate and disagreement, but the leaders will set the priority. And if they've decided that you're lower priority, that's okay. Again, you're still funded. Most teams aren't. There's an infinite number of things basically that could be being done. And you're on the list of like, we have a team, we can do work. But recognize that, yeah, if like team number 10 on the priority stack ends up being a little bit late because team number 1 needed to get it done on time, that's a worthwhile trade in many circumstances. And so anyway, yeah, just expanding on your idea.
I wanted to maybe expand a little bit more on, you mentioned your military experience. Mm-hmm. And certainly I actually study a lot actually from 2 areas. From the military, books like Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, who was a former Navy SEAL, as well as like, I really study football coaches a lot. And in fact, Bill Walsh has a great book, The Score Takes Care of Itself. I'm a big fan of Jim Harbaugh, of Dan Campbell, and certain football coaches that have like these philosophies that I just feel are so relevant when it comes to business generally, but also when you're leading a game studio or a game team. And so I wanted to maybe dig into that a little bit. From your experience in the military, what do you think, has that been helpful for you? I mean, you did just relate an anecdote from the military that seems like you've been able to apply. But, maybe you could speak a little bit more about that, about your military background and how you think that whether it's the military or other areas outside of gaming, that as game studio leaders, we could draw from in terms of lessons to apply to game development.
Yeah. So one huge fan of looking outside of game dev for lessons about leadership. Also read Extreme Ownership. I think it's great. I like Turn the Ship Around as well as another like military story. There's One Mission and Team of Teams. Those are both really good as well. If people are out there looking for book recommendations, those last 2 especially cover cascading vision in chaotic environments, which applies to game dev more than we think. So for me, I think one of the advantages of being from the military and being an officer in my first career, basically, was that the military is one of the only organizations I know out there that really deliberately trains for leadership. It makes sense why they do. But I went through a bunch of training and they had a philosophy, and I don't agree with everything that the way that they approach every problem in the world, but I have massive respect for the broad organization. And actually, the longer I've been out of it, the more respect I've had for the unbelievable challenge that they have to overcome and like the ways that they have to set up both systems and leaders to succeed, because they run the gamut from, we're in garrison and let's say we're stateside in a base, we're not deployed, we're not in a war zone or anything like that. And we have a bunch of people and we're trying to make them ready for the next time they might have to deploy. And this can be very boring, and they're just like, okay, we're going to go do this training, and we're going to make sure we do enough training every year, and we're going to make sure that people get to go to the range and shoot the rifles, so that we remember how to do that, and we're going to disassemble, and we're going to do it's just you're training, and then you go into a war zone, and you go from this very sort of regimented, almost boring environment into boring is not the right word, that's for sure, into the chaos of war. And in the background, there's still this logistical. I was a logistician. I was a combat arms person who ended up doing mostly logistics, and when I was doing logistics, it's like this is a regimented process that's very clean, but at any time something on the battlefield might happen that changes what's going on, and sometimes that's because of an enemy, like a literal enemy, not in the way we normally think of like, oh, I've got an enemy at work. Like, no, like someone who's trying to kill you with a gun, and if you're not ready for it, it's a nightmare. And even if you are, sometimes it's a nightmare. But in all cases, it's like how do you lead in these contrasting environments? And so what I would say I was observant of, and I think many of us were, what were the leaders that seemed to be effective in either environment and both environments doing? And what were the leaders that were ineffective in either or both environments doing? And kind of learning from that.
Right. And I actually think that the reason why, and I kind of wondered why are there so many great lessons from the military and from sports? And my hypothesis on this is because unlike in business, I think a lot of biases exist, especially if you're working for an existing company that's profitable, that's already achieved product market fit to scale, that's operating. Yep. So many mistakes can be made, and oftentimes because of politics and because of biases, you don't have to face reality. You can hide, you can blame. All these games can be played where it kind of doesn't matter. In the military, if you make a mistake, people die.
Yeah.
So the stakes are very high, and there is zero room for bullshit.
Yeah.
Because bullshit will kill somebody.
Yeah. And I think also, I'd say in sports example, you're all on display. There's no hiding. You ran the wrong route. You ran the wrong route.
There's consequences.
It's your problem.
Yeah. There's a score. And in sports, like head football coaches sometimes only have a single year. You perform on and you show what performance on the field, or there's a change, right? And so to your point, it's all on display. The stakes are high. And unlike in one of the problems with game development is like the cycle times are so long.
Yes.
Whereas,
it inhibits learning. Yeah.
Right. In sports and the military, cycle times can be very fast. I mean, there's a game every week. You see your mistakes on display every week. A game development project might be 2 years. And, for some of these big budget games, it might be 6 or 7 years. Yeah. You could be hiding major mistakes and biases for like 5+ years.
Yeah. And you wouldn't even know, by the way, because this is one of the things, again, like when you say hiding, it's not like somebody's like, oh, let me make sure nobody knows. Sometimes it's literally like we've rationalized this. Our brains are rationalization machines within whatever our environment are. There's a book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. He talks about this idea of we have like an emotional elephant that leans in a particular way, and then our brain goes into overdrive trying to rationalize whatever our emotional leaning was. And if you don't, even when you recognize that it's still happening, but you can kind of like be like, wait a minute, I think I'm leaning in a way. But it's like our brains rationalize everything around us. No, that's not that big a deal. Well, wait a minute, I think it is a big deal. No, here's 5 good reasons why it's not a big deal. There, I've convinced myself it's not a big deal. And now your game's dead. Because like you said, you're going to carry that with you. Right. And this, so wait, sorry, I jumped in, but this is like, this is it. It is how fast can you iterate? How fast can you be learning and growing? And you're right. In the military, I got a lot, like I led badly. and I led badly a lot in training, and hopefully not so much when it was real.
Right.
But I got some time, like I had the most embarrassing mission. Like it was a simple movement to contact. And so you're just like walking a unit through the woods, and I'm the squad leader, so I got 2 squads around me, and I'm walking my unit through the woods, right? And we take contact, and this was a really impactful mission for me. It really shifted a lot of how I thought. I knew that when you took an ambush, what you were supposed to do in the case of a close ambush, which is what we had experienced, we couldn't see the threat really. If you've ever played paintball or airsoft or been in the woods or anything, you'd understand. Like it's not like in the movies where you're just like, there they are. It's like even though their gun is supposedly flashing and all this, like it's really hard to tell where things are at and like who's allies and who's not. It's it's way harder than you'd think. There's a reason this stuff is difficult. But anyway, what FM 7-8, which is Field Manual 7-8, the infantry tactics book basically says is like in the case of an ambush, what you're going to do is throw a grenade, and after the grenade explodes, you charge through the enemy. Because usually if you're in an ambush, it means that you're in the kill zone, you got to get out of the kill zone, but you throw the grenade first to disrupt the enemy. Maybe if they're all running away from the grenade, it'll help make your charge easier. I don't know. I don't know exactly what was on everybody's mind behind it. You can kind of see it makes a little bit of sense. Here's the problem. In a real unit, who has grenades? Maybe most people? Well, we were in a training environment. We had one tennis ball that was a pretend grenade. And for some reason, and again, things to think about for me, the tennis ball was in the back of the unit. So we started taking fire. Everybody got down like they're supposed to. The instructors are watching, and they're watching me what I'm responding with, and I'm like, well, FM7-8 says we should throw the grenade and then charge through. So I start this, I'm not kidding, multi-minute mess of trying to have the person all the way in the back pass the grenade forward to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, so that eventually the grenade would get to the front, and then we'd throw the grenade, and then we'd charge through. You could say I followed the letter of the law and entirely missed the spirit. And this taught a really valuable lesson, because the instructors just kept telling me, like, this person's injured, this person's dead, and every time that happened, it meant like I was going to have to evac them in the training environment. And all. It was a mess. I did a horrible job of leading the unit. And I remembered something that someone who had been deployed overseas had said, which is, whenever you're in the environment, you have to do what makes sense within that environment.
Yes.
That's it. You have to do what makes sense in the environment, period. And so I looked at my lesson and I said, well, what did I do wrong? I followed the rules. You know, I grew up, I followed the rules. Like, I was an engineer. You read the rule book, I could solve anything. Just tell me what the rules are. Show me the manual. I can fix your computer. And what I realized is, like, in that moment, I'd followed the manual, and if it had been real, a lot of people would have died if that had been a similar environment. And so the next time I actually had a very similar thing happened in a more complex mission. We were supposed to go pick up a box, basically. And we took near fire. And so it was another near ambush. When they did that, they dropped a smoke grenade too to add chaos. But I realized that the smoke grenade obscured the opponent from us. And I immediately charged straight through the smoke. And so you hear like this loud bang, and we start taking shots, and I was just like, up, go. And I brought my unit up. We popped the guy, like, not really, you know, we came through with everything was blanks. So, and we basically bang, 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 because he was too close. You can hurt someone with blanks even. But we went bang, 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 and we got him, and we kept moving. And there was another thing that we had to solve. So that first one I barely qualified as, like, you did not fail. I actually did. In my opinion, I did. And I learned a valuable lesson. The second one, the guy who did that, he did this all day. He said, no one's ever come through the smoke at me. Like, I've been doing this day after day for I don't know how long. I've been running this exact same mission with cadets coming through. That's the first time anybody ever got me before I got to my second position. Like, he knew the routine. Mm-hmm. And it was because I knew in that moment, smoke means cover, I go. And could I have been wrong, and could I have run my forward element into like 80 guns pointed at us? Maybe. With the information I had, I didn't think that was likely. With the intel I had on the area, I didn't think that was likely. I made a move, right, and that move meant that we actually, like, isolated and destroyed the threat almost instantly to the unit. Now, like, yay, go me, I learned something. How many cycles of leadership do you get? The military gave me a whole ton. And I got to watch a lot of other people do the same thing, because I was like, that time I was leading. There were other times where I was following. And I got to watch people freeze, and I got to watch people make bad mistakes, and I got to watch people do a really good job. And I got to, like, look at how they're doing that. I don't think we get a ton of leadership cycles, to your point, in game development. Even if you're like, how many teams is someone going to be on in any given year? And how many times are they going to say, I'm leading, let me make a decision, and let me see what happens. There's a lag time, right? And it's easy to not pay attention to what happened, to move on to the next thing. Like, this is, one of my issues with all governments everywhere and all time, is they tend to make a decision and then they don't actually evaluate what the consequences of that decision were. And sometimes exactly the opposite of what they wanted to have happened, right? Like, simple example, we're talking about planning.
Yeah.
Oh, we don't know what's going to happen. Well, let's plan. Okay, that seems to make sense. Now, not only do we not know what's going to happen, but we're tricking ourselves into thinking something that's not going to happen is going to happen. You end up worse off than you were. You would be better off in some ways without the plan, because at least you're not lying to yourself. If I recognize both of those things, I can say, what would it look like to try to make a plan that may be accurate and where we know how to reevaluate it as we go? That last option, though, you have to learn through experience that, like, your first attempt at a plan is probably going to be bad. And this is, the whole, like, planning or plans are useless, planning is invaluable,
Yeah,
kind of
and
quote.
maybe I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but to some degree, what we see increasingly in Western game development is a very pretty plan with a huge
Yep.
budget, and because of the huge budget, you bring in the smart talking MBA who can talk really, really smart,
Yep.
who has no cycle times, but because of how well this guy can speak, makes the call.
Right. Yes.
So yeah, and so
That's the one of the production traps I talk about is the person I describe it as like always has an answer. There's a belief that I think leaders and producers especially, but I consider producers primarily leaders. There's a belief that they can fall into that your job is to always have the answer. And a lot of times the reason you think that isn't necessarily because you're an egotistical narcissist. Sometimes that's the case, but more often it's because throughout your whole career, what you've seen from leaders is people who are able to confidently stand up in front of the room and make assertive statements.
right.
And maybe you've been this person. I know I've been this person. I think we had a conversation once where I think you have been this person who's like sitting in the room while someone goes up and makes the assertive statement. And you're like, that's not right. And I know that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
But you said it so confidently that everybody in the room was like, oh, thank heaven somebody knows what's going on.
Right.
It's like, no, they don't. They just made that up. That doesn't even make like none of that. That was ridiculous. But the first few times that happens, you'll probably notice like your response was, if you had any humility at all, maybe they know something I don't. Man, they are so confident. And so confidence gets you a long way. And this is, right now I'm a consultant, but I look at other places in the consulting industry, like the McKinseys and the Deloittes and Bain and stuff like that. And I look at them and I'm wondering like, they figured out how to monetize their confidence to an incredible degree and to go in and tell people to some extent what they wanted to hear and charge millions of dollars for it.
Yeah.
And like you said, they're highly paid MBAs with no practical experience in many cases. But they're smart. They can put a PowerPoint slide together, like a presentation together. They can be compelling and convincing. They can talk faster than you, think faster than you. Like I'm not a fast thinker. I've noticed that about myself for a long time. If you get me in a room with a fast thinker, the fast thinker will eviscerate me in a debate. That's not my strength. But I can, once I understand something deeply, I can actually talk, hopefully, with some clarity about it. And hopefully that's actually grounded in reality. But like, do I ever get that chance? Well, if you got a lot of, fast talking, highly confident people, like you said, the MBA who's really smart and believes that their job is to exercise that intelligence through the lens of projecting confidence and knowing what to do. Like I said, and it's easy for that to come off as like I'm angry at them or mad at them. I know why they do it now. Like I think for most of them, I know why I do it. It's their own. Like this is what I'm supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
This is my job, and yeah. The problem is, yeah, it is, but that doesn't actually help anybody.
Yeah, and I can actually very specifically think of, I won't name the studios, but there were two major studios with extremely big budget games. And they did exactly what you were saying. They brought in, I won't say which consulting company, but there's probably two or three options, one of those companies. And they were having problems with like the traction of the current game design that they were going after. And so they literally went and did surveys and focus groups with players and say, okay, what kind of game do you like? Do you like, do you like this RTS? Do you like MOBA? Do you like this? And the players all came back and they said they like all of it. And so the game design wound up being 3 games in one. There's another game that was like 4 games in one. I'm talking, I know I'm very specifically thinking of one HD game project and a mobile game project. And so, like, to your point, like when you get the MBAs making these kind of weird decisions from the lack of cycle times and experience and knowing some of these lessons, you don't just ask players what they want. They'll just tell you everything. And then you just kind of create this Frankenstein, design. And to the point that, this team clearly then also lacked that, the tastemaker, the person who held the clear vision of what the players really wanted. And so they outsourced the design to player tests. So yeah, I
Oh
definitely think those are
gosh,
big deals.
yeah,
And one thing I also wanted to mention is like to your point also about when you said you were just following standard procedures.
yep,
We also have our number one rule at our game studio, which is the number one rule we have is common sense rules. Meaning, if there's anything that we do that does not meet common sense, forget about the rule. Just break it. Break the practice. And we
yeah,
got that from one experience, but also Jeff Bezos used to write these Amazon shareholder newsletters, and one of those shareholders newsletters, he wrote, you know, he wrote about how you have to always watch out to become a slave of the process because then that leads
yep,
to bad outcomes.
yeah. There's there's a frame around this, since I'm in the production side that I've picked up recently, which is whenever you create something and make it a standard, whenever you like say this is our process, this is what we follow, a way to think about it is it has immediately died. It was alive when you were thinking about it and talking about it and trying to figure out what it was. Now you've made it, even you've integrated it, or you've made it a reality. Like everybody now needs to follow this rule. It is now dead. Recognize it's dead, because when it comes to process, the processes you use in ideation are going to look different than the processes you use in post-production, and should. But if you put some process in place when you were in ideation and you never revisited it, the fact that it's dead and continued to exist while the environment changed around it made it go from being something that might have been helpful to something that was very definitely not. Again, some processes don't follow this, and some are more stable over time. Like, oh, like let's say in the US, our process for paying people is we use direct deposit. Cool, that's probably stable. It's probably gonna be stable for a while, right? Like, sorry, Bitcoin and crypto folks. Like, I don't think I'm gonna be paid in crypto anytime soon in as like a W-2 employee. I'm probably stable doing something else, right? Or sorry, sticking to that norm. But there are a lot of things that, as processes become dead and then hang around, and you keep them well past their expiration date. And what this implies is that while the process might become dead, you have to stay alive. And the leaders have to stay alive, and they have to be watching the process and say, oop, that bit of process needs to be revivified and reinvented a little bit and changed or removed or something, and then we can move forward. But if you're not doing that, I think all human organizations tend to almost like be gravity wells for bureaucracy to
Right.
slowly flow in, just this ever increasing amount of what each individual one makes sense, but in aggregate, you end up with this massive quantity of red tape. And all of that requires back ends filled with people, and it's very expensive, and it slows everything down, and we thought we were getting an advantage. And again, if you look at any individual one of those, it's like it makes sense why this existed. There was a time where somebody was not crazy to implement this policy to solve a particular problem that they thought was a big deal. Is that circumstance still true today? Or has this become something that's hurting us more than it's helping us?
Right.
We do not do a good job of tracking that over the lifetime. And it's because it takes time, it takes effort. Like one of the things I encourage leaders to do, and producers especially, where's your time to think in the day? Because if you're just running from meeting to meeting to meeting, I know you're a very busy guy. Like, how are you, I could ask this very seriously, how are you creating time to go, okay, all day, every day, I get a lot of to-dos from a lot of meetings, things I'm supposed to talk to this person, go do this, solve this, write this thing, all this different stuff. How do I prevent my day from just becoming all I'm doing is like nearest term thought around my next task, so that I can go, wait a minute, what's my job? What's my role? What do people need from me as a leader? And how could I actually maximally help this organization? I don't think people do that. So anyway, I'll ask that question. Like, how do you create space?
Yeah. So one, I think, unfortunately, I may or may not be doing a great job of it. I literally only slept 3 hours last night. So, it's not like I'm doing a great job of it. But one of the things I like to do is I like to zero-based budget my time. So essentially, I kind of mentioned this issue of biggest fire. So on Sunday, I try to plan out my week, and I just try to think week to week. And I have these lists of biggest fires in different departments. And so I oversee HR, I also oversee design. I'm now starting to get into engineering, oversee my product team. And so then I basically just try to fill in, okay, what can I reasonably accomplish this week? And I fill in my schedule. So then I start with the biggest fires, put those into my like task stack first.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I get to a reasonable amount, then I cut it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, throughout the week, things come up, plans change, and so I might have to readjust. But at the very least, I have a good idea for this week. Where's the biggest operational leverage that I can have on the organization?
Mm-hmm.
So, we call it like a bullseye framework, biggest fires framework, but this is the kind of way in which I try to prioritize my time. And that also means that there are many problems I just can't get to. And so
Yes.
I just had a conversation the other day. Hey, here's all these problems and why aren't we doing anything about it? And what I told her is I said, I am very aware of those problems. It's on my list. I cannot, we have to let it go. But I think the good news is, and one of the things that I learned when I worked at Fun Plus, working on King of Avalon, is that, and just actually generally, what I think is maybe surprising to so many people is that even the game studios where we had a lot of success, we had hundreds of problems.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's actually your ability to solve every problem in the game studio, but your ability to solve the biggest problems that are actually going to move the needle. If you can solve those, you can survive with hundreds of smaller to medium-sized problems.
Yes.
And you just got to, again, biggest fire, go down the list, but always start with the biggest problem.
Two thoughts come to mind as you say all that. Let me see if I can hold both of them in my head. When they've studied marriages that are successful over a long period of time, one of the interesting outcomes of that is that some of the most successful marriages, you'd think they're the people who best resolve all the conflicts. And it's nope. I think it's over half of the conflicts that exist in the most successful marriages are never resolved. And they continue, they remain throughout the whole relationship. And it's okay because everybody's heard. What was important is that everybody was heard. Now, obviously, it's not 0% of problems get resolved, but it's less than half. Less than half of the problems get resolved, and perhaps the ones that are most important. To your point, at least I would hope so. So I think that frame of there's going to be problems no matter where you are. There's going to be so many, something I advise junior producers to do, because when I was at Riot, I was in the discipline development space, and sometimes they'd we got a new producer coming in, go talk to Ben, and he'll provide some guidance around how to operate as a producer here at Riot or wherever. And one of the things I would say is you need to create a picture of what good is, because there are an infinite number of ways for you as a producer to make things better. And I know producers who worked themselves to death making things better, and they really did, but in ways that weren't the most impactful to the team or project or game or feature, whatever they were working on. And so they were just snipping away at smedges. Oh, I made the retrospective format better. Oh, I got rid of this meeting on the calendar. Oh, I helped us, have a really, I don't know, we went out to a nice restaurant this month. We spent our morale budget or something. We hadn't done that in a while. That was good. Look at that. I solved the problem. It's hey, nobody knows what you're making and how it's going to help the game. There are an infinite number, virtually infinite number of things you can improve. You have to pick, and you should pick based on your environment. I can't give you a list of first focus on making sure everybody collaborates well, then focus on making sure everyone's aligned, then focus. I can't do that. What I can say is you need to think about your team in its current context and where you want it to be. And some people go that's overwhelming. I don't know where I want it to be. And I say, okay, cool. You need to go figure it out. Go read Extreme Ownership or other books about all different kinds of industries, about sports teams. What would good look like? What does a high-functioning team look like? That's what you want. When you have an image of that in your head, you're going to be wrong. Don't worry about that. Delta where you are from that high-functioning team. And then go, what would be the biggest thing I could do? What's the biggest gap I could cross to get to that high functioning team. And I'll tell you something right now, you're never going to get there. You're never going to get to that point. That's okay. It's a journey. You're on the journey, the team's on the journey. The reason you're not going to get there is not because you're bad or the team's bad, it's because everything's going to keep changing. And so what there is will keep changing too. And you're going to have to continue to adapt to it and update and update. But you can get close. And man, when you're on a team that's close, when you've actually closed a lot of those gaps and your team is actually truly high functioning, oh my gosh, like it's unreal how smooth that can feel compared to when you're in the mess of just like, oh, but like I can make this little thing better. Oh, I can make this little, oh, I found this opportunity to do this. Oh, you're wasting your time. You're spreading your effort around. And it's not, some people like, you pushed one boulder a foot instead of a ton of pebbles an inch or something like that, or whatever the analogies are. It's not even necessarily that. It might be you move a bunch of things, but you move them with intention towards an end.
Right.
And that's what matters. The second thing I wanted to say, and I don't know if you do this, when I hear you describe that week thing, that sounds really cool. And I'm glad that helps you go like, here's my stack list. I would go, you've covered the short term from a CEO frame well. My next question would be, what are you doing mid to long term to think about that big picture? Even to go, this is where I want to be, this is where we are, and here's the delta. Because if you're solving the short term well, it usually means you're dealing with important urgent in an effective way. And then the next thing would be, how do you deal with important non-urgent? How do you create time for that? Because if you can't get into the important non-urgent block, you will always have a ton of important urgent and just a lot of urgent generally. And so like that would be the next question for me. So I'm curious, do you have a good solution for the mid-long?
I think just maybe because of the way I'm wired, I actually do spend a lot of time thinking about the long term, but the issue for me is around, okay, how do I resource this? Like, I do have ideas about longer term projects, capabilities, or people or things that we need to have later. But then the problem I have is deciding, okay, when are we going to spend resources for that? When am I going to shift resources? Yeah. So I generally have a pretty good idea of where I want the company to go and what we need to do longer term. But I think I still need to improve on how to prioritize it when we've got all these fires. And so that's kind of like the general conflict that I have with that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've managed this once, well, maybe twice, and it was more at the team level. One was like a 50-person team, and the other was much smaller. It was like an engineering team, where I got to. And by the way, I've been on a lot more teams than two, and so most of the time I haven't gotten here. That's why I'm saying that. Like this isn't easy. I reached a point where, as one of either the leader or one of the senior leaders of that space. All of the day-to-day fires and stuff was actually handled by the people around me. And I was like, it was really weird the first time this happened to me. It was really, really weird. Because in the military, I was always in the middle of it. Mostly I was an officer in logistics, and I was like mostly doing paperwork all the time. But like I got to this place where it was like, wow, the teams kind of run, and they run on their own. And I don't need to like do anything. Like, even if I don't show up, they still do all the meetings, and they still stay aligned, and I'm sort of there, but I'm not active. And it like opened up my mind to go, well, what's possible? And this is not something you get to quickly. It's something you get to over a very long, for me at least. Maybe some people can get there much faster. Wouldn't doubt it. There's some people I think are really, really good at this. But for me, it took a long time, like a year would be a short one of these. Like 6 months would be pretty optimistic for me to try to get to this place, even with like a single team. But I got to this place, and it was like, whoa, I can now think almost entirely about medium long term. And it was crazy. Again, it's only happened to me twice, but it's like, that's the goal. That's where I want to be. If I'm leading something, is how do I set this up? And it's weird. Some people get annoyed at me. They're like, wait a minute, you're just telling me like you had a job and you offloaded the job to everybody else on your team. That doesn't sound very fair. And it's like, kind of. The reality is that I am like, my job as a producer is inherently overhead. It's waste. If the whole team could just stay focused and do it all on their own and they didn't need me, that's actually a great thing.
Right.
Like if I have a high functioning team like that, that's amazing. And so if I can manage to help build the team, and usually, by the way, they were excited by the time they got to this point because they recognize the high function. If I could help them get there, and then I can actually step back, and now I'm just going like, okay, let me look big picture. Let me look at like, what are the risk factors? How do we set this up for success? What's the big, and not be stressed because I know that they can handle basically all the day-to-day stuff. It's an amazing spot to be. And I think more people should have that as the goal. Like when I think about that delta I was talking about, you should have that as the end state. Not that everything relies on you, but that almost nothing does. And then you get to advance in your thinking as a leader because you get to deal with the problems that most leaders never get to encounter, which are the big picture. How do I think long term? What is it my job as a long-term leader? It's actually very different from my job as a short-term leader. And there's unique value to be given to the team through taking that stance. Anyway, just something.
Yeah, no, no. I think when it comes to the longer term planning and thinking, generally think about one, new game projects and when we should start even planning for those. Second is I know there are very specific live ops capabilities that we're going to need when we actually launch the game. When do I work on that? And then
Yeah.
also to the point that I think you were getting at organizationally. I mean, one of the ways that I think about the company is in 3 layers: individual contributors, managers, leadership. And then how do I build, especially because we're weak in the management and leadership stack, like how do I build capability people in those layers so that, to your point, I can have more free time. I don't have to go to India 50% of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when do I like, and I am working on some of those areas at times, like less so the new game stuff, but more like the live ops and the organizational stuff right now. But
Yeah.
when I spend time trying to develop those things is a tricky problem. But
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I, by the way, right now, I have a chief of staff and I'm a one-man shop at building better games outside of my chief of staff and like some sort of external contract support that I get to help with, video editing and different things like that. And it's, I mean, yeah, sometimes it just feels like I'm treading water all day. And I've got big dreams about like, I want to get this thing out, and I want to do that, and I want to do, and it's like, yeah, but the podcast, right? And got to get the newsletter. Oh, you got to make the LinkedIn post. Oh, taxes. Oh, you got to deal with taxes because who else is going to deal with taxes, right? And it's just like over and
yeah.
over and over again. So I definitely feel you. I have felt more like I am trapped in the now in the last probably 2 years than I ever have, and that's been really educational for me. Just like, yeah, I have a lot more respect for people who start businesses now. I wasn't like I didn't before, but now I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like I'm running a one-person shop,
Right.
and with again chief of staff, I got some help. I got some really good help actually, but this is it's harder than you think. So it's way harder.
Yeah. And maybe I know we've been talking for a while, but I do want to like cover a topic that's a little bit more optimistic in nature because we've been talking about all these problems and issues, and I don't. But in reality, for me, when I look at the games industry today, I am probably more optimistic in terms of the number of opportunities than I have ever been before. And it's because of, new capabilities, whether it's AI or others. But I also think that there's so much space for innovation in a lot of games and game genres. And so I'm really excited about that. But maybe in terms of the optimistic discussion that we can have is,
Yeah.
so you've worked at the very successful game studio, Riot, and with the other game studios that you've worked with, I'm wondering if you could also just talk about some of the general patterns or characteristics that you've seen from some of the more successful game studios. What would you say are 2 or 3 characteristics that you think would be common amongst the studios that actually do find success and that are able to have great games, however you would define that?
It's an interesting question. The thing that comes to mind for me actually is that it's possible to over obsess about culture, but I think for most of game dev's history, we didn't really think about it at all. And it's now okay to talk about culture. to talk about how do we create an environment where people can be successful. And there's a human centricity that is growing. And I almost hate to bring it up because it comes with baggage.
Mm-hmm.
When I say that, around, maybe some stuff I'm not as excited about or don't think is as effective. Like, I'm not talking about we all got to get in a circle, talk about our feelings twice a week or something like that. But I mean just this idea of, imagine if you had a team of people that were engaged in the meaning of what you were doing. Not just like, well, we're passionate game developers and we're just so happy and excited we get to work in games, but really like locally, I am excited about how I am contributing to the development of this game, whether it's a live service game or a sequel or a new game. I think we're caring more about that. And I think and I say this in a time where there's a lot of layoffs for sure, but I actually see a lot of studios that seem to care about this when they didn't before. They just didn't, and they're caring about their people. They're caring about doing better. It's not just a grind to get the game done with endless crunch. You don't see that as much anymore, and I think that that's all positive. And I don't think, some people might say that's why we're going downhill because we're not crunching all the time anymore. And I'm like, no, yeah, I'm sure there's some people that could probably have worked harder, but man, some of the death crunches and death marches that certain game studios have experienced, I don't think they were benefiting anybody, and they were destroying lives and potentially even the game because people were doing subpar work after working way, 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 way too much over way too short a time, to the point where they didn't have any energy or juice left. And so they were just, they've done studies around this with engineers and stuff like that. I think we care about that stuff now. And I'm positive about that. So in terms of trends around successful studios, I think that's one. I think we also we're learning better. So I don't know how else to say that. Not everybody, but like I see a lot of the most successful studios actually value the learning. So when we evaluate whether something is successful or not, it's not as simple as did it achieve whatever, be it an ROI goal or whatever. Is also like this element of, it was like, what did we learn from this? And I mentioned earlier that idea of like the more learning loops you can go through, the better off you're likely to be. No guarantees, but it stacks the odds. I see more companies valuing learning, and I see more companies encouraging their teams to try stuff and to learn, not necessarily at the AAA level, at the smaller levels, at your double A's, single A, your indies. Like they're taking, to your point, they're taking bigger bets, and the tools are now out there to support them. And so the iteration loop is no longer as awful as when every studio is relying on a proprietary set of tools to build something. Like you get so much, you can get so much speed and learning from doing something in a non-ideal setting, but just like throw it in Unreal, throw it in Unity, throw it in Gamemaker, whatever, and see what happens. And I actually see I see the best studios taking advantage of that. Last one I'll say, I think video games will always. I think video games is likely to continue to be a volatile industry for some time. And that's because we do have, compared to software development, we have a lower hit rate because we fight for people's attention. And people have a lot of things that are doing that.
Right.
And so I think that continues to lead to, like I said, you want to be Nostradamus in games, just predict everything will fail, and you'll be right, 95+% of the time. That said, I think that as we iterate faster, people are taking learnings from past studios and bringing them forward. Like, we're having this conversation. I didn't invent the games industry, and I'm not some genius guy. I'm just a guy who likes observing things and trying to analyze what's going on. And when I see myself and you and others sharing insight about, like, wait a minute, these things are happening at the leadership layers of organizations or how we're approaching game dev, we don't agree on everything, but we're having conversations that nobody had 15 years ago
Right.
in game dev. And so we are learning. And this is where I say, I don't know if it will always be a volatile industry. I think we had a little bit of time there where it didn't seem to be as volatile, depending on where you were. But there's other people I know that, like, there's never been a period where their project didn't fail or the studio wasn't shut down every couple of years. And so that's nested into this, and we're getting better. And I think that's the encouragement I have to anybody, because I feel, I really appreciate you pointing out, like, it's easy to, like, I can get focused on the problems. But whenever I'm talking to someone, I'm never like, yeah, it's just all problems, we're all screwed. It's like, it's all problems, but it's always going to be all problems. That's life. Welcome to life. That's what life is. Life is a whole ton of problems, and your job is to navigate through and take on that challenge. And you can. And whether you're a leader just starting out, like with only a couple of people that you lead, or you're in charge of a studio, you going, what can I do to make the world better tomorrow than I did today? That is always you always have that option. You're not always going to be right. You're going to mess it up. But, like, start taking those chances and keep just making wherever you are better. And honestly, the studios that enable that in the people inside of the company, like you were talking about, enable that the conflict, the challenge, the autonomy to go try things, I think those studios tend to do better. And I've seen that in some AAA places. I've seen that in some indie places. Like there is a value to be had from just going, like, I can't fix all the problems, but I can fix some of them. Let me try. And the cool thing is, the more you fix, the more in reach the bigger ones become. So there's kind of a rambly answer to your question.
Great. Maybe I could also give you some of my thoughts and
do it.
Get your honest feedback on kind of what I think. Well, I'll actually start with one that I actually got from. Well, you were at Riot. Maybe you know Slim, for our audience, the guy who's basically the creator originator of Valorant. But I was having dinner with him about a year and a half ago, and basically I asked him, Slim, what does it take to build a successful shooter game in today's market? And his response to me was, he said, this is going to sound a little bit strange, but I think the answer is love. And what he meant by that is that there are so many decisions that have to be made on a game, thousands and thousands of decisions. Mm-hmm. And like the team that loves the game, that loves what they're doing, will make the right decisions and will do what it takes to make the game successful. And I thought that was, interesting, because I never had thought about it or framed it in that way. So there's one characteristic, one characteristics where I may disagree, or we may have a different opinion, is that in my experience, just working with a lot of game studios, I do think that a hardcore work ethic has outperformed, like, the studios that really, like, work a lot. The probability of a successful outcome, I felt, was dramatically higher. It's not 100%, but I felt in my experience it was dramatically higher. And the only thing there too, though, that I would add some nuance is that I think that there's a little bit of nuance and framing to this. And I think that the framing is that having a hardcore work ethic is inherently bad. And that the framing, especially within the last few years, is that any company or any game studio that has a hardcore work ethic is evil. But I've never really thought about it that way. Kind of coming as an older guy, having grown up in, or having spent my career in Silicon Valley, there was a kind of a different framing to hardcore work ethic, which is that, one, when you work that hard, it's because you like it, you have a passion for it. Also, there's kind of like the Viktor Frankl, Nietzsche sort of concept that growth and even value for your life comes from pain and suffering. And even Jensen Huang from NVIDIA says, I think he was talking to Stanford, and he basically said, I hope and he said, I say this with glee that pain and suffering happens to you because of the character that it builds and like the advantages that it has.
Yeah.
And so there we may have a little bit of a difference. I don't know, or maybe not.
Not probably not as much as yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll let you finish.
Yeah. A third concept. So there's a biblical verse, and I'm not Christian, but there's a biblical verse about shepherds and the hired hand. And I don't remember the biblical verse exactly, but it's something like,
Mm-hmm.
when the wolf comes to attack the flock of sheep, the
Yeah.
hired hand scatters, but the
Mm-hmm.
shepherd protects the flock. So
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that you have people that care about the game, and I think this takes many forms by not, because there's a way of implementing hardcore work where you're like,
Mm-hmm.
you guys gotta work, and there have been plenty of really evil leaders that
Yeah.
don't share in success,
Yes.
where it's
Yes.
like,
Yep.
oh my God, we made millions and millions and millions of dollars, and now I'm rich. And guys, I really hope you appreciate the iPad I got for you guys. Congratulations.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That is
Exactly. Yeah.
so bad, so unfair. And
Yeah.
so I do think that being able to build a team of shepherds that care, but you have to also give them a reason to care. It's
Yes.
also a characteristic, I think, of success. And then just the two other things is that just time, right? Like I've noticed that the teams that have worked together for 4+ years, dramatically higher outcome of success, a probability
Yeah.
of success, as well as the teams that generally have focus, that aren't doing like 10 different games, but focus in a
Yeah.
specific area and genre. But I'll pass.
Yeah. I think all of that. So the idea of love, I really like that. And I think there's a set of concerns that we have as game developers and especially as leaders in game dev. You have to love the game. The game is made by the company. You have to love the company. The company is made up of devs. You have to love the devs. And ultimately, there's the player, and you have to love the player. And you're constantly balancing these four things. And I love that frame of love because when I think about love is it's a poorly defined word, I guess might be how I'd say in the modern world. But it's like you want what is best for the other, both now and into the future. So if you come from that place, I think that I think I agree with you. I think that maximizes your chance. In terms of the other stuff, the reason I was even so hesitant when I was talking about it is I'm not I don't like how work-life balance has been co-opted to mean, to your point, like, well, that just means that when it's 5 o'clock, I have to go home. It's like, well, what if you're not done? It isn't that a judgment call that you should make about what's important to you in life? And and you say, well, what about your family or your personal time or you should always be the most important? I'm like, no. Of those, your family maybe. If the work gets in the way of your family, I think that's depending on who you are. That might be a no go. But there's a time I go home or I go downstairs to eat dinner. And sometimes when everything's not done, that means I come back up once the kids are in bed. My wife, heads to bed or whatever in the evening, and I get back to work. It's like, well, wait a minute, Ben. That's you time. It's like, yeah, but you time is spent working sometimes. Why? Because it's important. Because I care about what I do.
Right.
What, like, maybe if I didn't, I wouldn't do that. But, and I'm an ex-military guy, right? I was deployed. Well, I'm sorry, I don't want to work right now. It's a war. Like when I got to Afghanistan, I was the only person there. I said earlier that like I had one other Sergeant First Class Jamal White. He was brilliant. I learned so much from him. He didn't show up till about a month and a half in because he was working somewhere else. He came on a later flight over. And we had convoys coming in. Like I said, I was doing logistics and I was moving all these trucks around. And they would come in at all times of the day or night. And they would either fly in or drive in on these convoys. And someone had to meet them. And I was the only person there. There was a good 2 weeks when I first got to Afghanistan where me getting 3 hours of sleep in a row was uncommon. the Army had trained me for that, and I was glad they did. I had to keep functioning. And then I had to go do, after those 2 weeks, I had to do another 50 without a break. There was I shouldn't say that. There was a 2 week period where I got to come back for leave, about 9 months in. But that was it. I was in Afghanistan. I was in a war zone. I didn't get to like, hey, everybody, like, I'm just not feeling it today. I think that's an extreme example, but I like what you said about both Viktor Frankl and Nietzsche. I love Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. He talks about, I love when he talks about suffering. He's like, we got to be careful trying to remove suffering. Nothing good in your life or anybody's life has come except through suffering and the solving of it. So there, I think you and I are probably more aligned. There's probably some edges where like, I am cautious in creative work at how hard, because I've looked at a lot of the studies around output over time, and crunching for extended periods of time reduces rather than increases team output. It's hard to measure outcome exactly in a lot of these, but like at least we can measure output. And there's not a one-to-one link, but there's something there where I think it's the studies I've seen, and they're older now. You have a couple weeks where you get a decent jump in productivity, and then it starts tapering off. And by the time you get to about 6 to 8 weeks into hard, like crunching everybody, really, really overworking everyone for a long period of time, you have not just gone to a place of you're getting less output than if you hadn't crunched, you've also taken the team to a place where you've lost any benefit that you would have gained from the couple week push. And you're even more screwed because not only have you lost relative output over time, but also to return back to normal, you have to go even slower. You can't just like, let's just bring it back to normal. Nope, now you'll be at a decreased indefinite. Right. Now, there's subtleties to this. Every person is different. I know one guy who works 90 to 100 hours a week, and he's just like, it's what I do. I love it. I don't know what else to do. And I'm like, hey, you need to get a hobby or something, but like, hey, dude, it's your life, man. And if this is what you love doing, some people can do that. Most people will experience some consequence of long-term overwork. And this is where like, I actually like the idea of work-life balance, but I don't like how it's been co-opted into a place of we no longer get to make judgments. We no longer get to have that hard push of a couple of weeks, or we no longer get to make the call of like, I'm going to do a little bit of extra work today so that I make sure that we're ready for next week. And I think it's actually, so one of the things that's interesting about that, the love concept that you were talking about, love is an external thing. I think when operating well, it's like, I'm interested in the best for others. And even if I'm interested in the best for myself, it's almost myself as an other. And so when you're thinking about like what would be the best for others in the long-term way, maybe it's that I do some extra work right now. And that's, in some sense, that's so that I can look at myself in the mirror and say I did what I could to make this work. But it's also because like, dude, that's how I can add the most, I can have a meaningful life, and I can add the most value to the world. And trying to strike that balance is an individual thing for each person. Something I've said is I don't know many people who have a meaningful life who are not tired.
Right.
I think there's a connection there. And I think the people who are like, I got to make sure I get my 8 hours of sleep every night. It's like, cool. I think you might be sacrificing your meaningful life a little bit, and you might not even realize it. You may think that is a meaningful life, is a life that's not tired.
Yeah. From my perspective, I just wish, or just choice, right? Because I think earlier in your career, you might choose for more push, more hardcore. Later in life, you might not, or if you start a family, or you have a baby or something like that. And so you might have periods where you're going hardcore, you're going work-life balance, you're going hardcore work-life balance, or you might, but you choose based on your personal situation. And
yes. And by the way, I'll say one thing further. Yeah. When you first start your career, when you're young, that's time to push.
Exactly.
I don't know if you were just going to go there, but like, that's when you push. Please, 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 please don't buy the like, I need to get paid a lot of money when I haven't been doing this job for very long. Or I need push, live in the apartment with the roommates, drive the beater car, don't get paid enough. Those are your 5 to 10 years to learn. and to become a valuable member of society, please go do that. And, not everybody has to make that choice, but man, I wish more people would, because I'm not telling everybody to become a workaholic, but it is like, dude, that's your window.
Right.
If you walk out, if you hit 35 and you're like, wow, I'm really proficient at something that not many
Yeah.
people are proficient at, suddenly you have the option to not work as hard because you can outthink everybody because of the experiences you've had. You want to be there. You do not want to be in the situation where you're 35 and you don't have a valuable skill set. You haven't learned how to learn. You haven't learned how to go hard. Because push early.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
Like, as an older guy in the industry, I have, and I won't call out specific people, but I've seen some people who were incredibly intelligent, super smart. They went to company A, and this other person who was kind of okay went to company B. Company A was a bigger company, fixed processes, did not have much challenge. A couple of years out, they come out, there's a big gap. There is a huge gap between skills, capability, mental mindset, all of that, because challenge causes growth.
Yes.
As you were talking, Ben, I actually remembered a quote. I don't know if you've seen the old movie called The Third Man, but I just want to read this quote for our audience.
Yeah.
So from this movie, one of the characters states, in Italy for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. But they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So anyway, on that note, I thought we could maybe end this discussion. We've been talking for quite a while, but I do want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about building better games. You could talk a little bit about why you created the company, how the company's changed, what you're up to, all that kind of stuff. I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Okay, so building better games, it was born out of this idea I had. I joined Riot out of the military. I started as an associate producer, and I asked, like, what should I go read and research? Because I've never done game development. I just like games. What do I do? And people were like, yeah, I don't really know. Some of them gave me some books to some agile related stuff or some general leadership stuff. There wasn't anything that was from game development outside of, I think, Clinton Keith's book, which I would still say is one of the best game dev specific resources, maybe the best game dev specific resource out there for a leader entering game development. And his book is very focused on agility applied and Scrum and process stuff. I wanted to solve that problem because I knew that there were a bunch of other producers that have joined companies since I did who had that same issue. And then we're left often trying to figure out, well, okay, so I'm getting some mentorship, I'm getting some leadership, but is that any good? I don't know. How do I tell? I don't know what I don't know. Could somebody please provide me some resources? Building Better Games is an attempt to answer that. So I do some training. I've created an online course. I'm working on another one, actually on estimation of all things.
And I didn't remember that one.
Yeah. It was one that originally I wasn't that excited about it. And then I saw how many people were like, I want the estimation course, please. Thank you. So I'm like, okay, all right, never mind.
I'm literally going to sign up for that right after.
It's not out yet. Nothing's out yet.
Let me know.
Yeah, we'll do. So I did another one on how to be a successful game producer. I talk a lot about leadership. I try to work with companies to improve their leadership and to work through how do you do those things? How do you avoid the scaling trap? How do you avoid the planning trap? How do you avoid leaders who aren't comfortable with uncertainty? How do you avoid not having an aligned vision or tell that that's happening? I work with companies, try to resolve that, to get them to a place where they are going in the same direction. They're dealing with reality. And their leaders are actually being trained to be cultural beacons and vision beacons within the company, not just, filling out spreadsheets and reports. And so, so that's what I'm trying to do. I want to help leaders lead better in game development. I see it as a huge opportunity for our industry, a lot of room for growth. There are so many more things we could have talked about today, but so many of them come back to how are leaders acting because they set the tone. They're like producers and leaders, they're force multipliers in their organizations. And so if they're bad, then that force multiplication is really bad. Like you get division rather than multiplication. But if they're good, oh my goodness, they can be such a help, a boon. They can drive you towards success. I started the company almost 5 years ago with a coworker who had worked with me at Riot, Aaron Smith. He helped with a ton of the early stuff around models and all this stuff. Only this last year did he depart. It was something where he had some other stuff he needed to go do in life, and I was sad to see him go. I loved working with him. If you actually go listen to some of the old podcasts that we did, I mean, you can hear like the guy knows what he's doing. And he helped come up with like the holistic leadership model. He did the training with me. He's a great guy. But he's left now, so I'm picking it up and moving it forward. I do a podcast called Building Better Games, the Building Better Games podcast, where I focus on leaders who are frustrated with solving the wrong problems, and I try to help us get towards solving the right problems. There's a newsletter I post on LinkedIn. You can find me there. And then I have the courses and some other stuff. I've done different trainings, and a lot of it's been B2B consulting style engagements. But honestly, my preference is for the teaching and the training and the helping people grow. That's always been like, even when I was at Riot, and that was where I loved doing that. I loved managing. I loved leading, helping other leaders lead. I always felt like I was so much more impactful when I was sort of sitting on someone's shoulder, helping them think through a situation. I could do it, but it was like, I wasn't as fun. It's weird. I was a weird guy because I got to be on these projects and some of them were really cool and fun, but it was weird that like I would ship it and I'd be like, okay, cool, that's done. And everybody else would be like, yes, this is so amazing. I'm like, well, on to the next thing, and but man, when I help someone succeed, when I help someone grow, I just love that. So that's what I'm trying to do.
All right. Awesome. Well, I'll actually include some information in terms of links to your website and maybe ways in which they can contact you in the show notes. But Ben, we've had a pretty long conversation today. Thank you so much. Pretty wide-ranging, but yeah, we certainly left a lot of stuff, uncovered. So
oh my goodness, yeah.
Hopefully we'll be able to have more discussions in the future. And for our audience, if you've made it this long, congratulations, and we will catch you next time. Thanks, Ben.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Thank you.